Not in a good way. Bonjour. My name is Dancing Star. I come from the Bear Clan. I'm a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. The territory I come from is a little place called Monture, which is about 19 miles outside of Indigenous in Nova Scotia. Although I live and work in the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, I'm the Anishinaabe, or for many people who maybe Métis or Cree or ancestors are made up differently, we call Toronto. I started out acknowledging our ancestors and those individuals who've been here long before we were, that walked and left their footprints right where we're sitting today. And so I asked the ancestors, Creator, all of us, with our kind hearts and our brave minds to be able to ask the questions and wait for the answer. Today, I feel very honored to be among the women who have come to share with you today. We've been friends a long time, raised our children, moved around, got degrees. And every now and then we reconnect with the topic that we want to share. And for me, I started working within the prison system in 1978 on the East Coast in Dorchester, Spring Hill, and Westmoreland, which was at a point where the maximum and the medium and the farm camp. And one of the things that I got my feet wet and was the Friendship Center movement in the country. And that we began to fight for what we believed in. We fought for our relatives to be able to get a smudge inside of a federal prison and have them able to access who they are. And so I started to work at Prison for Women in Kingston, Ontario, provincial institutions in Ontario, out west, many different places, traveled across the country to go meet prisoners and their families. And we worked so hard back then, but we loved it. We loved what we did. And we weren't afraid of a warden. Like, who's a warden? But then there's a person above them that's a commissioner. I'm not afraid of them either. And today, I'm really sad because we spent a lot of work. My friend Trish, our friend Trish, and many others to fight for equality, the rights for our Indigenous, both men and women, to get out of jail on a release program. And it's gone back to the way it used to be in the 1800s. And so what I say to people is look at when the first prison, maximum security prison, was built in this country. It wasn't even a country. It was in 1840-something, Kingston Prison, maximum security prison on the shores of Lake Ontario. Next, Prison for Women. Next, Stony Mountain Prison. Next, St. Vincent, something or other. It's been closed for quite some time in BC. You can track when those prisons were first built and then the residential schools. They weren't about keeping us safe. they built those walls so nobody could see what was actually going on inside. And it fed a judgmental attitude towards those people would say were criminals. That they felt that they shouldn't even have a TV. And so I'm happy to be here today to talk about that, because then we moved in to the murdered and missing and Indigenous women in North America. And that hasn't stopped. We have lost so many women that my prayer today is, Creator, bring them home. Bring closure to the families who are hurting. Let's not be afraid to talk about the issues that are real. Police violence. Both my community, both men and women, are being beaten and murdered almost on a daily basis by those people who are supposed to protect us. And so when I started working with a man by the name of Art Sullivan and many of the other early days, Sam Augustine and many of the elders, I didn't know what the word abolitionist was. I didn't even know it existed. There was like that international, Amnesty International, but we didn't have time for words like that. What we had time for is to stand up and continue to do that. So thank you. You know, I've been taught that there is something that we can give each other that we can never take back, ever. And that's the time we spend together. Today you chose to come and hear us and gift us with that time that is yours. And you're going to be really impressed by the women who speak to you today. And not only share their time, their words, and their children. So thank you. Well, and so my bear is in the bag.
This is Juba, named after the capital of Sudan, and support animal. Just a bit of background before we jump right into its questions. My name is Audrey. I'm one of the co-founders of No More Silence. We're coming up to almost 20 years of working together. In 2024, 20 years. Carolyn is here with me, also a longtime member who's now based in Newfoundland. And actually the last time some of us were all together was 2016, because we started about in 2011, I believe, with a series of conversations that we started out calling The Silence is Broken, because we called ourselves No More Silence at the beginning, because there was silence around this issue, right? And around 2011, we realized, okay, the silence is broken, but the violence hadn't in any way stopped. And unfortunately, I have to say that still the violence hasn't in any way stopped. I've been really, I'm sorry, I've been so gutted thinking about the murders that happened in Edmonton just on May 5th. A mother picking up her child from school, and the media still handles this subject. Like, that's one of the few things that have improved a little bit, but this time around it's been awful again. You know, they're talking about a random act, but why is it that Indigenous women are always the ones that are targeted in these random acts? It's horrifying. It was good to hear Carolyn remind me that our work has still mattered. And we don't know how much worse it would be if we hadn't been doing what we've been doing for 20 years, right? And we always knew when we started this that it was about decolonization, that we will not end gender-based violence until we have land back, until we have fundamentally transformed this land. And that's a lifetime project. I was texting with Alex Wilson last night, who was also part of this project and was also in Newfoundland that last time. And she reminded me, yeah, this is our life's work. This is a life's work. And I started this work in '86. I'm coming up to 40 years, and I'm not done. We're not going to be done. I still am super excited to hear the mainstream talking about abolish. I didn't know that was going to happen in my lifetime. That was pretty amazing, after the murder of George Floyd, and not too long after Regis Korchinski Paquette here in the city, to have people in the street demanding dismantle and abolish police. And today we're talking, about prison industrial complex. A bit of context, it was always a Community Knowledge Alliance, I think, that we got funds from. We got a little bit of that. I want to thank them for that. It's a university grant from U of T, and they helped us out a little bit again. They've made it possible, Northlands is a network that brings people together that are like-minded with this idea of radical change and transformation. That's what sets us apart. And we're not all in Toronto, and so they have helped us in the past come together and have these deeper conversations. And a break from just, from the daily work of supporting families, of holding vigils, of doing the spiritual ceremonial work. So I wanted to acknowledge them. And that's the Women in Gender Studies Institute and Bonnie McCallany, who I'm grateful to. Oh, and the other thing that I wanted to mention is that this panel was supposed to happen in 2020 at an abolition convergence that people were super excited about, and that so many people put so much labor into. Sherry is one of the organizers of that. People were coming from all over the world for that, right? There was people coming from Aotearoa, from all over, and then COVID happened. And NAISA was supposed to happen then too, at the same time. It was also scheduled to happen at the same time, and we had pitched this panel to NAISA, or NAISA, I never know what you say. And we had it, we were accepted, but then everything got canceled and postponed. So we ended up using the time where we were all on lockdown and doing Zoom I decided to do interviews with the people that were going to be on the panel. And those interviews, Carol and I then worked through together and wrote a book chapter that is coming out in the Abolition Social Work book in 2024, spring, I think. So there's more people than the folks sitting here, but they're all going to be in this chapter, and it's in much more depth than we'll go into today. Alex Wilson is another one of the participants, and Christa Williams. I may be forgetting someone, but that is just the context. And I'm going to facilitate with questions today. And starting off with, I'm going to ask everybody just to situate themselves in how they come to this work, sort of a little bit how Wanda did that. For us at No More Silence, it's been like a bit of a conundrum. For me, I'm mostly German. I was politicized in Germany. My background is my mother's German, my dad is Irish and Anishinaabe on his dad's side, my grandfather, and his mother was Scottish. But my politicization happened around Palestine, and there was a lot of prison support work. It was also for me supporting political prisoners in Germany during their hunger strikes. Those were members of the Red Army Fraction and the 2nd of June movement, who in Germany were imprisoned for decades and subjected to isolation torture and came out completely debilitated. So I sort of had an early recognition that prisons needed to go. And one of my favorite actions was when the Red Army Fraction blew up a brand new prison without hurting anybody that had cost millions of dollars before they could put that prison into operation. It was called Weiterstadt, and they just blew it to pieces. And I think that was one of the best things that they ever did. So that's where I come to this work from. And when we are working with families of missing and murdered, we very often, and I find this with myself too, we only have right now the settler colonial legal system. And so people equate justice with carceral punishment. And when they're hurting so bad, and like so many families that we've walked this brief road with, that's what they want, is those people to go away forever. And like the case that I just talked about in Edmonton, that person had been in prison many times who murdered the woman and her daughter, non-binary child, I think was starting to go by the name Jane. Prisons don't help. They don't fix things. So that's where I come to this work from. But it's a conundrum, we're not going to tell families, we're not going to talk to families about abolition when we're supporting them, at the strawberry ceremony that we've been doing for 18 years. Now we had our last one in Toronto on February 14th for 18 years. But what's exciting is that Indigenous people have their own legal traditions, and for me, it was Angela Davis and the Red Army Fraction that inspired me before I came here. But then coming back to Turtle Island, to realize that there's like legal traditions that are thousands of years old that we have the good fortune that we can go back to. You know, we don't have to start from new. And some of us are working inside my day job. I'm in the legal system, and I see myself doing harm reduction work, important harm reduction work in there, because people are treated so badly by this legal system. But I'm going to ask Christa to start us off with this first question. Like, do you encounter this as a conundrum in your work? Like, how do you come to this work, and how is that for you in your daily work? Because Christa is like a leader for our people in achieving justice. She was a senior counsel at the National Inquiry. She, in her job, does so many inquests. Like, a good example of what prisons do to Indigenous people, they kill people. How many people that die in custody that come through ALS? I'm going to give the mic to Christa.
Name, Monture, Christa EDG on Indigenous cause, Lynne D, Georgia and Monture. Gimmickly, you do Jake, technically, Wabama, definitely. English and until the sexual English, and for having me here. So I just introduced myself in Anishinaabe, which is one of the traditional languages of this particular territory. My people was part of their territory. So I'm from Georgia Island First Nation, and I explained that I am, because we in our Indigenous legal tradition, Anishinaabe have something called Canoe, which is constitution, and the laws and rules. And we had something called Canoe, which is advocates. So not lawyers, but like advocates. And we had a whole array of different types of advocates. Maybe if you're in the middle of a breakdown in your marriage, you'd go see one of the Canoe to counsel you or talk to you about your various rights. And so we, pre-contact, had Canoe, which was advocates. So I explained, because I'm not a chief like a political chief, but I'm the head of advocates. So like the big little chief of advocates, because there's no direct translation for legal director, all those who seek the truth. So Aboriginal Legal Services and Anishinaabe name, which Art Solomon and a number of the elders like actually gave the mandate to the organization, 30 some odd years ago. So well before I was there, but and then we also were given all those who seek the truth. And so that's what I explained. I told you I am from the Otter clan, from Georgia Island First Nation. And then I thank the creator, the grandparents, those that have gone ahead of us, our ancestors, as well as those with us, Wanda for opening us. And then just thank you for being here. So that's a really good question. It's a really long question. I mean, I think I could do a whole course on it, to be honest. Like, it really could. Audrey's absolutely right. Like, first of all, if you told me back in 2011 when I went to Aboriginal Legal Service, I thought I did a lot of volunteer work. If you told me that the rest of my career would make me become an expert in Indigenous death in custody, internationally, I would have been no way, right? But the reality is I've now done over 50 inquests in Ontario. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're individual. I'll be going to one in 2 weeks, in less than 2 weeks, as co-counsel with Caitlin Casper from our office. And it's in relation to the death of Shannon Sargent, and this is all, I'm only disclosing making this publicly available. But she was an Indigenous woman who was in custody following heart surgery. She had substance use disorder, and unfortunately, when the police picked her up and they took her to the detention center, a really concerned and genuinely kind nurse wanted her to go back to the hospital because she didn't like what was happening with her. She didn't like the way she looked. She tried to get her to go back. She was put into a transport, took to the hospital, but never walked in, never admitted, She was back to the detention center and she dies of coronary attack. And that was in 2016. So the family's been waiting since 2016 for this, even pre-COVID, delay after delay after delay. Her mother, Rose, has now passed. The great-grandmother was still alive when Shannon died, then her mother, Rose, died. And now her daughter, Shauna, is our instructing client. So she's the only woman in a family of 4 generations of Indigenous women that have lived together and supported each other and lived through all sorts of triumphs and joy just being together, but also a lot of hardship and a lot of overcoming barriers and systemic harms. And so, in 2 weeks, we'll get to, on behalf of the family, make presentations in a very, very colonial process. So I'm a Canadian lawyer. I'm not an Indigenous lawyer who can off my gown and because of legal traditions. I love that. And I do actually participate in ceremony, which is part of our law. But as a profession, I'm a Canadian lawyer. And so, here's this woman, this Indigenous woman who is mass over-incarcerated, way over-incarcerated. In fact, the police, when they picked her up, if they picked her up on a warrant, she could have been released on her own recognizance. But she's taken to a detention center, right? And so this is not an uncommon story. And unfortunately, as the senior and then lead commission counsel at the National Inquiry, we heard this story, and I was actually acted as counsel for a party who was standing there. We heard this story over and over again across the entire country. So it's a really weird struggle because you have Indigenous people who have, and I use the word victimization in the colonial or Canadian law context because I prefer the term survivor or survivors, but we have all these individuals that survive this harm or that go through, we have as much victimization as we have quote-unquote criminalization. But in this country, I've stopped using the word over-incarceration or over-representation for about 5 years now. And the only words I will use when I refer to Indigenous people in custody in this country is mass incarceration. In fact, you can take the academic studies and information done in the United States around Black mass incarceration, and they have larger populations, but per capita in Canada, Indigenous incarceration is parallel to the mass incarceration. And it's such a weird world that I live in because when we do inquest work and we're representing families to have their voice heard, and a family asks us that one of the recommendations we make is that they build a new jail because the one that individuals in are so dilapidated and so horrific and causing so much harm that they need a space that's a better place, that is more therapeutic. And so we find ourselves advocating for recommendations to build these new elder prisons, which is very difficult as an individual who is totally against incarceration because also, as Audrey has explained, prisons don't make better people. If anything, there's a good demonstrable history in this country that it's created a number of issues, not only for individuals and a failure to rehabilitate or to allow individuals to reintegrate. You don't want someone who spent hard time back in your community because they're coming out worse than they went in. And you also don't want those people without knowing that they can make some commitments and accountability back to the community in your community. And that doesn't happen in CSC and Correctional Services Canada. That doesn't happen in provincial custodial facilities, even when there's good elders and good programs on the ground, right? We have good elders doing good programs on the ground, but that's not necessarily everything that a person in custody. So one of the big tasks we do at Aboriginal Legal Services when we do this work is we try to change the language, and we've been trying to change the language for years. It's a very colonial process, but by the end of it, if I haven't made everyone refer to an individual as person in custody instead of an offender or an inmate, then I feel like I haven't done my job. When it's a health professional that's in the custodial facility, if they're not calling my client's family a patient, then I'll remind them they should be calling them a patient because there should be equal access to healthcare inside of the custodial facility as there is outside. And what would you call that person that walks into your clinic? Would you call them an offender? Would you call them, no, you call them a patient. So we've been doing this kind of work for years where we're trying to change some of the language so we can try to change some of the perspective. I think, and I shared this with Audrey, and I'll wrap it up because I want to get to Michelle. One of the things that I found most interesting, when you advocate and support people and all they see is incarceration or all they see is sort of the culture of Canadian justice that is punitive and says, when somebody does something bad, you lock them up, that's how they believe their loved one who maybe has either been disappeared or has been murdered gets any validation or like any type of addiction, validation or awareness, because Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited, transgender, gender diverse people, we're less than worthy victims in this entire system, right? And so for a lot of people, I feel like I've learned over the years, they want the person that hurt their loved one to experience what anyone else would, because that would make them feel like, hey, look, they're listening. Like when you see thousands and thousands of dollars go out in searches for non-Indigenous women, but we can't get news facilities to come to us. We can't get police services to come to us to do the ground searches. We want sort of an equalization. But the irony is, when we incarcerate people, particularly if they're Indigenous people, we're not getting better communities out of the process, community members out of the process. We're causing deeper harms, deeper pain, deeper trauma. And so, I think the thing that I told Audrey was one of the most difficult things for me during the National Inquiry, because I assisted in the narrative process and the family sharing process. I assisted about 150 families share their story with the National Inquiry. I wasn't their lawyer, I was like a lawyer in the public interest, but I sat with them while they told their story. And, there was in more than one instance a family calling for like capital punishment as part of their testimony. And I, in my position, act in the public interest, and I'm supposed to be unbiased. And so what do? Like, I literally hold that person's hand, or I encourage them to answer and make their recommendations without, in my mind or in my way, screaming like, but we can't do that, right? So, and so it's a really interesting balance. And so there's gentle ways to work with people to, who really have that, like, have you thought of this, about that? It's really hard when people are in their worst pain, like when someone in their family's been murdered and they're in their worst pain, to ever see that there could be good out of something different or good out of something traditional. But then there's a whole bunch of people too who also believe in traditional paths. And so there are ways for it, but it's a really weird balance. The way I've always done it, in my Canadian lawyer's hat, my Canadian lawyer's hat tells me, these aren't my stories, this isn't my narrative, I'm just there to help other people. I'm there to support them in telling their truths. So whatever it is they need that's truthful, and remember, truth is different for different people. They're not always mutually exclusive positions. My job is to help them do the truth, and much what Audrey said is harm reduction. When they go through these really colonial processes, where there's a whole bunch of fancy lawyers acting as proxy professionals using a bunch of legalese that no one understands, that I can translate for them what's happening, but I can empower them with those words so they can sit there and listen and know too, and their own voices can be heard. And so I just kind of get to be a little bit of a conduit of everyone else's storytelling and truth sharing. So for that, I've always felt like I'm very fortunate to be able to do that. Should we let you?
Okay, what brings me to the word? I think it comes back for me as an Oklahoma woman and being raised traditionally in my community at Six Nations and raised with clan mothers and faith keepers and chiefs and knowledge holders. And having that knowledge, but then also myself being an intergenerational survivor of residential school and that cycle, the cycle of violence that has impacted me personally, and being a target of violence as a child and then as a young woman. And then trying to come to terms with that, and actually not really knowing what it was until going to law school. And then going to law school and realizing the impacts of colonial law on our people. And the whole intention of colonial law was to erase us, or try to erase us as a people. And then starting to see the layers of violence, not only on me, I had to figure all of that out. So figure out for myself and my own healing, and then seeing the impacts on my family and my nation, my community. Like, it just kept getting larger and larger and larger as I was learning more and more, and understanding the impacts. And so what had really impacted that, and the reason why I do what I do, is because of the crisis in Kanesatake. So there was a war against our people in the Oka. People know it as the Oka crisis. So there was a targeted that was the spark, really, that started it all. And realizing that impact. So then I became a lawyer. When I became a lawyer, actually while graduating law school, working with our people back home and with our leadership, it was, what I call surface work. It's like land claims, treaty rights, land, right? Like that's like surface stuff. I mean, it is self-determination. We're talking about who we are and our nationhood. But it wasn't until in talking about all of that, all of the underlying things and the conflicts internally within our own people and the factions and the things that were happening internally. And then seeing how the impacts were on the women. When according to our laws, women are supposed to have leadership positions and understanding the roles that they have, and actually seeing the target against our own women is when I said that's enough of that. Because I was strong at that time and felt really strong about it. And so that's when also in the work, the anti-violence work and empowering our women and the strength that I know we have as women. So that was the spark of it all.
My name is Monture. I'm from Six Nations of the Grand River, Wolf Clan, and Mohawk. I come from the same community as Beverley is. In fact, I've been Beverley since we were in grade 5. But my path toward this work is a bit different. Like her, I was politicized by the crisis of guns and doggy as well. But instead of going into law, I wanted to go into the media because I felt that the representation of our people was so completely wrong, and that they were like, the media was tending to like cast us as villains when what we were trying to do is preserve the little bits of land that we have left. And so my entire life has always been around how do we explain to the majority of settlers what we're actually about and what we're doing. And so my life path, I became a union rep, first with the Canadian, or the Communication Energy and Paper Workers Union, CEP, and left it before purchasing Unifor, and worked for the Canadian Media Guild, which represents workers at the CBC. And while that's really interesting and useful work, especially when I was helping out Indigenous members, there's something about the way Canadian settler society is structured that really, really bothers me. And part of that is because of the way colonial capitalism deprives our communities of the economic resources and the land base that we need to thrive. So that's number one. Number two, like when we try to raise a complaint about that, then it uses the legal landscape of injunctions to try and remove us from our land. And so consequently, and because I come out of a union background, often corporations will do the same thing to unions to prevent them from striking. So there's a convergence of what colonial capitalism does to our people. And for me, the work, I started also coming to know my silence in about 2012. And that was after we had lost in our community a young woman named Tashina General, who was murdered by her then boyfriend, who was a lacrosse player. And the subsequent fallout in our community was so heartrending and awful because it became factionalized. People blamed her, this young woman who was also pregnant at the time, so she was pregnant with a child, and she was strangled by her partner. And people blamed her for her own death. That there was this inherent idea somehow that she was the cause of this. And so there was a trial, and he was eventually convicted, but then he appealed the decision. We went as court supporters for No More Silence. The mother of Tashina is also my sister's one of her best friends. So I went as court support because I knew the family. And I could not believe what I was hearing in the court. That the defense team talked about provocation as the means for why he needed to get out of this prison sentence because she had provoked him. And because it had never been an explicit instruction to the jury, he has essentially got off on a technicality. And while, this is a case where it's a tragedy all around. We have a young man who's basically forfeited a lot of his life. He was able to get out of that. Is that justice for Tashina's family? And I don't, they suffered every day with her loss. And the carceral system that the family went through, thinking they were going to get justice, in the end did not get justice, nor did it heal the breach in our community. And so there has got to be a better system for this. And I'm very lucky, my dad and my entire family are very, very much about her. And so I went back to our history to learn, what did we do pre-contact with these kind of cases? One of the things I learned is that it was extremely rare for a man to attack a woman because of our place in our culture as the life givers and essentially the power of our community. We choose the chiefs, the how we control, the economy is controlled by us, because we are the life givers, the lineage of our clan is determined by the woman. So all of these things, and we're not seeing it in our own communities. We're not, because the Canadian system has overtaken us, overlapped it, and so then when our families require justice, they need to go through a foreign system that does not give the kind of justice that we require. So that's how I got into this work, and I started to really realize a lot of this is around punishment. It's not around restitution nor restoration of how these families get back into balance. And so for me, the carceral system is this overarching alien system for us. It's extremely alien. How is it also starting for us, what is for us justice then? Because we're already starting from a point where it's not really justice. And so that's why I do this work. And hopefully now that I'm a little retired out of the labor movement, I can devote a little bit more time to it. So that's what I can do. Nyala.
Gila Kasla, my name is Sarah or Taliki Lokwa, and Bagyo from far away, the other coast. Wapakiwak and Bagyo from Shakis or Fort Rupert on the northern part of what's now called Vancouver Island, and Zawadena through my grandmother, Helen Nelson from Kinkaman Inlet, which is also north and over onto the mainland. And I'm also Ukrainian and English through my mom. And it's just such a real honor to be speaking with you all today. So I just want to really thank you, Audrey, for the invitation. And just to think about, as you're saying, those almost 20 years, just how long we've been in dialogue and coming together to do this work. For me, that's such a key, the community building and being able to share strategies and have these kinds of conversations means that the work can continue because of how, especially, thinking about a couple decades ago, as you're saying, the No More Silence, it was breaking the silence, and now that we have more visibility and recognition of the violence, but nothing has really changed, or maybe in some ways it's gotten worse in my mind. Being able to be in community is so important, so I'm really grateful to everyone and to everyone who's here. I guess when I think about what brings me to this work, and especially relationships with prisons and policing and the carceral system, criminalization, I also think about our laws as Kwakwaka'wakw people. So we are a potlatching people, we have a feast system. My family, I come from a family of hereditary chiefs and kind of leaders in our community. And so kind of having a seat within those systems of governance and understanding the roles that not just people who are in kind of those leadership roles, but every family member having a place within that system of governance, right? That the names that we carry, the crest that we have, our connections to the land. So the thinking about kind of within a Kwakwaka'wakw worldview, our laws are kind of interscalar, governing our bodies, our houses, and our land. So like our bodies and kind of our names and crests and the dances we have, the positions in our family are another kind of expression of what is held in the landscape, our position, our connection to place, our origin stories, and connection to our ancestry. So that kind of whole worldview across those different scales was fractured through the potlatch ban. The potlatch was banned for 80 years. It criminalized, that was, I think, kind of when I think about the roots of criminalization and how it impacts my life today, that's really where that started. So criminalizing the practice of our governance system meant that some of my relatives were imprisoned, went to jail, and did so for resisting that, like for insisting that we're going to practice our laws. You can't stop us. And it, although that criminalization happened and people were imprisoned, the system is fractured, but it is still partially intact. But what has happened, I think, since then is that because of all of the other forms of kind of legal violence in our lives, that has meant that especially patriarchy has reshaped our governance system so that now when I think about the realities of gender-based violence and the role that plays and the relationship with the justice system, it really all has its roots back in those early days of criminalizing our laws and trying to ensure we could speak our language and practice our laws, because now when violence happens, so for myself, I had interactions as a child with police because of domestic violence, and the police were not in a position of care or justice, obviously. So, those are kind of early days of seeing how the violence of policing and just really the lack of response, the way that the kind of trick of law that makes us seem like, yeah, you call the police because they're there to protect you, and in fact, it just enables further violence and further, allows for those cycles to continue. And so that, I think, had brought me to, as a teenager, there was my cousin who died, who was about my age. She had spoken out about abuse within our community by a powerful leader, and nothing was done. And she took her own life. And then through those discussions, really amongst especially young two-spirit queer and women and girls in the community, realized how many people were being harmed by the same man, and that people had gone to the justice system, people had talked to each other, but there was no response, just that it fails to matter at every scale. So for me, that was really my way into thinking about how we navigate, what are the options? The options are all bad, because our kind of traditional or Indigenous systems of governance and law, thinking about they are so fractured, but they're also thoroughly textured now with patriarchy, so that they're not able to function to be able to respond when gender-based violence happens. And then we obviously we have the harms of the justice system too. So all of those systems often enact further harm. And when we look to for folks who have gone through either Indigenous legal processes or different kinds of restorative justice or things like that, because of how colonialism has harmed our communities, that it again often there's just very few examples where there's, as you're saying, what is justice? How do we answer that question? What does justice feel like? What does it look like? We need to keep asking that question, because none of the answers we have right now are just. So so I'm grateful for this conversation, because I think it's through the sharing our stories of what this looks like, hopefully we'll someday have answer to that.
So I was actually hoping that Sarah would answer this next question, but I'm going to actually put it to Terri first, and then you all might have something to say. But it was something that came up in our Zoom conversation when I was interviewing you that I found really interesting. Because I asked myself, given that it's so clear that the system isn't working for Indigenous people, is it because there's nothing else? Why is it that people still turn towards state-sanctioned retributive justice solutions when it comes to MMIW, GHS? We all do it. When Holy Bushi's murderer walks free, we're horrified, right? Or Tina LaFontaine. There's just so many cases where it's so painful to see that difference, I guess. And someone was talking about equality, so that's maybe part of the
through there. But Sarah brought up, and I thought this was so interesting, I'd never thought of this, that in land back movements, people look to decolonize justice. They're not like looking, there was a time actually around like in the 90s where people did, like there's a lawyer, Bruce McIver, I think was his name, and he got his card and everything, because he would try to bring like colonial law to the courts, and you just get kicked out of court, because even though you're like citing their own laws to them, they just did not let it work for Indigenous land back. So people are more inclined to look at traditional justice when it comes to land back and to talk about sovereignty. So why don't we do that when it comes to gender-based violence? And I'm gonna put it to Terri to start talking about that. Because there's a big land back at Six Nations, right?
Yeah, right now, at Six Nations, if people aren't aware that there was a land development, a housing development essentially, on a 43-acre parcel just outside Caledonia that was slated for bill in 2020, right around the time of the pandemic. And a group of people from my community, tired of seeing this because again, and the other point is that every time a new housing development goes up on our lands, once it's there, that land can never be recovered. So we have a vested interest in trying to make sure that our lands, and I'm talking everything east of number 6 highway. If you look, there's a map out in the hallway that shows the Holman tract. Everything east of number 6 highway has never been seeded properly. So essentially it's being squatted on now by settlers. The towns of Caledonia, Cuba, and Dunville are completely settler community or squatter communities that have just taken over. And all of the land in that area, every time there's a new housing development, that means we can never get that piece of land back. So one of the new, and this was a kind of a grassroots intervention by several young people in our community, and then women, and also a lot of the, supported by the clan members again, because that's how we do our thing. So the chiefs have to go along with it. They went and took over. And so consequently, after the OPP spent, I believe it's $23 million in trying to police that area and keep the insurgent, I don't like to use the term insurgent, but to kick our reclamation people off. And to this day, they've not been able to do it because they can't. It's our land. And, despite Canada's desire to move more settlers into our area, they are wary of it. And there's been a moratorium on development issued by our hereditary chiefs council. So we are very much watching the kinds of things that go in. But they use injunctions over and over and over again to try and police us off of this space and then individually target members of the community who are actually doing the work of reclaiming the land. So pretty much everybody who's been on that specific site has either a warrant out or has been arrested. And then the question becomes, how do we get that justice? But the thing that I find really interesting too is that this has always been an issue in our communities. But on one hand, you will not get people at Six Nations to obey the cops. But on the other hand, if something happens internally in our communities, the first people they call is the cops. So the dichotomy of what are we doing here? On one hand, we decry state violence, but on the other hand, when there's drug dealers or somebody's car gets stolen or somebody's wife gets injured, we're not calling we're not calling the clan members. We're not calling faith keepers and knowledge holders. We're calling the cops. At Six Nations, we have our own police force. The majority of them are members of our band, but there are a few that are not. And now, on one hand, that it's kind of useful. If I had to call him when my dad was really ill, and maybe call him and bring him to the paramedics and all really joking nights, and what. But the question becomes, how useful is this when something really serious goes down? We had a case last year during the pandemic where a young girl was attacked at a house where she was trying to leave because she would not give a sexual favor to his 2 little boys, and they attacked her with their dog. And her face was literally torn apart. Those guys were arrested, but subsequent to that, there's not really been any kind of thing going on because one of the boys was the nephew of the police officer.
So then, we're back to that whole question of what does justice really look like, even in our own communities, when we have these tensions between, you know, the fact that we are looking for our land back, that we are trying to do all these things that are cognizant of our traditional values, but yet at the same time, when something goes down that people are feeling harmed by, they call the police. And so for me, the question always becomes, what do we do with that tension? And I think a lot of it has to do, and I'm going to be kind of flip about this, but I do think a lot of it comes from the media, specifically watching cops and robbers programs. You know, like we get this idea about how justice looks like in a courtroom and all these things, and that somebody's meted out a certain amount of stuff, but we're not thinking about what does justice really look like. It shouldn't be about punishment, but we should be talking about restitution and restoration. And how do you get back into balance when a person, and let's be honest, in a community like ours, like all of ours, we're all related. So how does one family get back into literally balance with the people of that other family when there was harm done? And I think that for us, like that's the bigger question that we need to be asking ourselves, as opposed to who's going to come in and make the judgment, is how do we do this for ourselves? And so for me, that's the focal point of this work, right? Like how do we get back to that place where we don't need police, where we don't need judges, and where we don't need people going, well, I'm siding with them because of this and all of that, because we had traditional methods for getting back into balance with each other. It's just a matter of finding what those are and reinstituting them. But my question, but again, like in a community like ours, that's easier said than done because there's been so much colonial influence on even how we think about our political systems. So it's a big uphill battle, and I think that it's like, again, it's the work of a lifetime. Like, I mean, I've only come to this work in the last 10 years, but I guess in a lot of ways I've been doing it my entire life. But now the bigger questions are, what is justice for Indigenous people? And what do those justice models look like if we think about what they were in the past, and what are they going to look like in our future? So that's the big question for me, and how we handle that.
About the two systems. So there's the colonial system and an Indigenous system. They're two totally different systems. Just the whole language and worldview and the way that we think about, for us it would be restoring harm. So if we cause harm to someone, or someone caused harm to us, it would be, well, what are you doing to restore and repair the harm that you've done? So this would be internally. So now we have a whole system that's been imposed in society where we think that that's where justice is going to be found. We know that justice will never be found. It'll never be found within that system. So if we come to that realization, like we're saying, this is a lifetime of work. So when I graduated started law school in 1991, that very first day was like, what is this? This was ridiculous. The way that the whole colonial legal system is all property based. It's all based on ownership and nothing about humanity. There's nothing about healing. There's nothing about that retribution and restoring harm. So it becomes a struggle. And because of how, being raised within a highly political system. So I was raised with the Confederacy, with our Haudenosaunee chiefs and clan mothers, being raised born into it about self-determination. So I've always had, you know, in our treaty system with the two-row wampum. Everybody knows about the two-row, and so it's very specific that we hold our laws in our canoe and they hold their laws in their ship. That's so specific. And so our laws have been impacted so much because these colonial laws have interfered. We've never been able to establish or use a real justice system according to our own laws because the system has been enforced in our communities. So now we're trying to peel all of that back. Like, stay over there. I want to swear, like, stay the frick over there. That's how I was raised. Like, you stay in our canoe. You follow our laws, our language, our laws, our beliefs. But we've been impacted so much by these colonial values. I said this is my master's in law thesis, and I called it Eurocentric diffusionism. That's where we thought our thoughts are so imposed by these colonial beliefs that we forgot about our own. And so now my lifelong journey is to re-empower our laws so that we do know what it means. So we're teaching our young people about the responsibilities that we have, you know, and even the reclamation of our ceremonies, the reclamation of the rites of passage ceremonies. So we teach our young people about having healthy relationships. Teach them about it was never taboo to talk about sexual relationships. We're always taught that. And those ceremonies that we have to strengthen our young people. And I can see it now. I can see that with our young people who want to raise their families with those traditions, with those laws, and they respect each other. It's rare right now because it's just becoming revitalized as a result of that. And so trying to maintain that when this other system is still there, that screws things up. Screws things up right from the get-go when it comes to policing, when it comes to the courts, when it comes to the judges and the lawyers who are involved, and the jail system. We never had jails. We never had jails to throw our people into. It was about, like what Terri said, it was when somebody did harm, they addressed it immediately. There's no way that they would ever let a woman be abused because it wasn't an individual thing. It was a clan, it was a family, it was a nation, and it was addressed immediately. That's why you very rarely ever knew, or that very rarely there was ever abuse of anyone. And so that's now today trying to address that. So we have a lot to do because we're educating our community, right? Because of the impacts of colonization, having to impact or teach about the impacts and why things are the way they are, and then educating the colonial system and saying that, listen, this is what you're doing to our people, this is what your systems have done to our people, and stay away. So I've been involved in the legal system and now in the education system, and trying to do all of this educating everywhere, every opportunity that I get, and to focus on our laws. And it's difficult as well because it's in the language. All of our laws are in the language. And I'm not a fluent speaker. I'm impacted by it as well because my grandmother was in the Mohawk Institute. She refused to be Mohawk when she came out of that school. And so, fortunately, my mother married into a traditional family, and she was the only one of all of her 8 siblings. And so, my dad's family was Longhouse family. And so I was able to be raised in that, and my mom and dad made a conscious decision, and I was the beneficiary of that. And so, as a result of that knowledge and learning about colonial law and everything that it's done to our people, like I said, it's that lifelong work. So I'm going to teach my kids. I'm going to teach my grandkids, and I'm gonna be a great grandma. My future generations, and being able to is hard because we're now dealing with addictions. And so the addictions and the drugs and the alcohol and all of that stuff that's now got in the way. Now having to deal with that is a whole other level, which is the impacts of colonization. So anyway, that's what.
Beverley. I'm not going to take up too much time, but I want to follow up on something Beverley just touched on, and that's like the what we need to know or what we need to teach our children, particularly. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, we need to teach our girls this, or we need to teach our boys this. But I think it's actually about teaching traditional belief systems and the way. And one of the first things, so one of the things that we did do with the national inquiry is, you know, Anishinaabe people didn't have gender binary. So one of our expert hearings, we brought in knowledge keepers that talked about traditional ways of knowing and identifying being as opposed to like a real binary. That was important, but when you were talking, it reminded me when we were in Moncton, we were in the family hearings or truth gathering, but we had a traditional panel of knowledge keepers, and that included Elder Begonanin, Elder Imelda Pearly, I'm sure I'm saying this wrong because I think it's Mi'kmaq, name is Okula Sumawe, and Dr. Judy Clark. So they had their Indigenous and non-Indigenous names, and they talked about puberty ceremonies, traditional puberty ceremonies for both like biological genders, and they talked about how girls would learn that respect and that value through these ceremonies and through these traditions. And I mean, in Anishinaabe, we have something called strawberry ceremony, right? And part of the strawberry ceremony is, and part of what you do when you're doing the berry fast is learning things about life, right? So when we berry fast, we don't eat berry for a duration when we first get our cycle because we celebrate moon cycle because it's creation of life. And then you still have to gather berries, you still have to collect them for ceremony, you still have to wash them and give them to other people. And you know how tempting it is when it's like strawberries and just perfect. It's like choose a berry, right? And you're not allowed to eat that berry. And part of that is a lesson, right? Like you're doing a berry fast and it occurs over months. But it's actually it's life lesson, and it's a responsibility. And every time you touch that berry, or you're touching this berry, you remember I'm not doing this. I'm preparing these for others, for their wellness, for elders, and stuff. It reminds you that. And it's funny because more recently, one of our traditional teachers of Aboriginal Legal Services was doing an opening ceremony for the new courthouse here at the new Super Court in Toronto, and there'd been all sorts of ceremony, and there was a bunch of bowls, and there was still we took the bowls around. And going to finish the berries, right? And it's funny because she had just finished saying, "Oh, I'll put this with the spirit plate and we'll burn it." And then she was kind of there, and I came back, and there were still others. I'm like, "Can I have some of those?" And she said, "No, I already said that you give them to the ancestors." And I was like, And she's like, oh, like I don't have to explain it to him. Like, no, because, I learned that. That's something I learned. If they're going to someone. So it was a lesson that I learned many, many, many years ago, but it still had application, right? And it's to understand the generations behind us, where we are now, and the generations in front of us. But when we do that ceremony, when we teach our children those traditional processes, we're actually implementing law, right? And there's a bigger and bigger revitalization of that occurring. And when we revitalize our traditions and laws and practices, we're actually creating the space, or re-entering the space, or reclaiming the space that has been taken from us. And so any opportunity I get to do that, I try. That's funny, as my daughter's actually here today, and she went through the berry fast and didn't like it either because she loves berries. And so, but yeah, so it's one of these things, and I think the more we get into technology and youth, like our kids are so much smarter than us too, right? They are so much more exposed to things than us though too. So it's funny because I feel like it used to be kind of easy when you had a community gathering to get the kids to do things because that was our activity or fun or outdoor stuff, and it's harder to keep kids in. But there's some ingenious, inventive ways that there's a lot of people out there trying to get our language revitalized and put into programs that kids will access. Every time we reclaim our own identity, our own traditions, our own ceremonies, we are practicing Indigenous law and we are reclaiming our space. So that's been my focus and goal in terms of how do we do that? How do we go back? Because I think I already said, I think people just want equality and we don't see fairness when others get things and our people still don't. But when we reclaim that space in that area, we're actually giving ourselves this opportunity to do something that's going to have more meaning in the long run, right? Is my belief. Like I think we do create kinder people in that process. It's not perfect though, and we have like a host of problems, but that's my big focus and goal.
I'll just briefly say, I guess, when I think about sort of this situation, especially in the last while where land back has been so, we see people show up, there's real clarity about Indigenous assertions of jurisdiction or Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination being core to that we wouldn't turn to land back isn't to be solved in the courts. I guess that's one of the, we see people showing up, putting their bodies on the line, wearing their regalia as a sign of asserting their laws, carrying their laws with them. The way that people show up and mobilize around that in Victoria and on the territories we had a few years ago, the kind of Indigenous youth-led I don't want to say occupation, it's authority of their land, but taking over the legislature there and how long that lasted. We saw tons of settlers show up in solidarity. It was a real stance for land back. And at the same time, that very same time, there's lots of different kinds of gender-based violence coming to light in the very same local community. And it's, as per usual, like that. It's really, and I actually do think that because there is more visibility and recognition, because we have hashtag MMIWG now to us, that it creates the appearance that there's more awareness. It creates the appearance that something's happening. People can come to an annual march. They will have different symbols like that. Actually, the visibility tricks us into thinking that we've kind of got it handled or something, instead of saying like, no, we still need to show up for each other just like we're doing here, exactly the same thing. So I think that for me, that real discrepancy, I guess there's so much, but two things that I would say. One is, really shows how like the impact of colonial ideas of what the political realm is, what is political, what is kind of the realm of governance that we think about issues around land as being politicized. That's because settlers value the land. We don't value our lives because that's just an echo of that. So I think that that has really been internalized into what the political realm is for us as Indigenous people and communities, and where we put our energy, and that is again like structured through heteropatriarchy and all of that. And also, I guess the other important point is that the reason that we keep turning to the courts is because of the immediacy of the violence. So, we don't have the time to, well, especially when we're talking about the most extreme forms of violence, when our loved ones are killed, or when we are injured or someone's life is at risk, and that's when I talk to people, over the last few decades about when do they call the police. It's often like, well, I would never call them because I know it risks more violence, but if someone's life is at risk, mine is, or my child, or, that's when people turn to that system often, knowing the harm that might come from it. But so it's that immediacy, and so that's what I think, for me is important, is to build up when something does happen, that we show up for each other, just like we show up when we need land defense, we show up at each other's homes, we take care of each other, we show each other that a trespass has happened, harm has happened, how are we going to help you to right this, like, in the immediate? Because the more we do that, even if it starts with a few people, to me, that's where we start to change the way that we see this as not just about political, like worthy of building up our laws and our sites of governance, but that we show each other that we matter enough to take a stand in the same way that we're doing out there, we're doing it like right here with each other. So, yeah.
I just wanna add something because it just reminded me what Sarah said about, so the work when I was in Vancouver with an organization called Indigenous Association of BC. So I developed a whole 5-day workshop for community safety planning. So it's like what you're just saying, that it's a community that takes ownership of the violence, and that there's natural people in the community who actually take on that job, like homes, safety homes, homes where people are feeling safe. But to me, that is like where we take our power back and we take that ownership of that community work.
Carolyn and I were talking about this the other day. She just kept saying patriarchy. And it has a lot to do with patriarchy, right? Like it brings me back to my early days in how, like the first time I got to go to Palestine during the first Intifada, and it was very much about, well, we have to get the land first, and then we're going to deal with this inequality. Like, it was very much this Marxist kind of approach that sort of had a hierarchy of oppressions that we're going to deal with one after the other. But I love what you're talking about here, about showing up for each other. I had 2 more questions, but I think I'm really going to go to the very last one, because we still, we can't ignore the settler state. So how do we, while we are decolonizing and working to build up like these beautiful things that we're doing with education, with our own ceremonies, applying our own laws, all the things that have been brought up, we still have to hold the settler state accountable. And how do we do that? And that shouldn't just be Indigenous people, but anybody who wants radical transformation in this country needs to be involved in doing that, like pointing out the wrongs and holding the state accountable. But what are the challenges? What are some? I know that you talked about co-optation that happens when we, like, No More Silence never takes funding from the state, because we know that ends up driving the work, right? That never comes without conditions. So that's something that you had mentioned in the interview. I'll ask you to answer first.
And when I say impoverished, I mean that we have to fundraise for everything. Like, even our sports teams, like on the res, there's forever advertisements for spaghetti dinners or like whatever, or little like silent auctions of beadwork. Because literally our communities suffer from some of like the most harshest conditions. We've never gotten up to the level of Canadian society because we have been deliberately impoverished. So consequently, you introduce money into the equation, and however that money comes, whether it's from a government grant or some kind of, benevolent funding organization, the question then becomes, how is the work being driven, right? So for us, a lot of now that I've been working, because I work with No More Silence and also in my own community, Protect the Track, we are doing the same thing. We refuse to take government money. What that means, what kind of money, where are we going to get? So what we've tried to do is enter into partnerships. There's a lot of universities that have money for this kind of community organizing, right? Like for this kind of project base. Because that's how we're kind of trying to do it, is under the guise of specific projects that are designed to do our traditional activities on our land and build the capacity in our own communities for people being able to do that. So we've done things like have a high tanning camp. We've done things like do a regalia making workshop. We plan to do a fish high tanning in the summer. We're going to do a live corn, the entire process from start to finish in the fall. These are the kind of things that we're trying to do, and we're getting some university grants to do it. But part of our major thing is to talk about our traditional ways. What are we doing here as Haudenosaunee people? If we want our land back, what is our society going to look like when we get it done? What is it going to look like? Are we going to reinvigorate our Haudenosaunee traditions in a way that actually makes sense for us? Because our people are very pragmatic and very adaptable. We have always done that. We have always adapted our ways in the face of whatever onslaughts come. So we know that we are highly adaptable, really flexible, but at the core of it all is a very proud and long tradition of a Haudenosaunee philosophy that holds our people together, despite all of the things that have happened to us. We're still here. And that strength is what drives us. And so one of the things that we try to do is talk about that. Talk about our inherent resilience, our resistance, and how do we get back into the balance, because that was also a big thing in our initial philosophy, to be balanced between the nations, to be balanced between men and women, between children and parents, between the ways that we think about things, to balance all of the things in creation so that we all have a place to stand. And so these are that's the conversations that we kind of are trying to have on a daily basis whenever we do activities that are traditionally oriented. We want to have a piece in there where we talk about what does it mean to do this as a Haudenosaunee person in 2023. And I think that that's where we have to really kind of look at things, is get back to the basics, but understand that we are now in 2023 and that there's certain things that we're going to have to adapt. The other thing, though, that I also want to point out is that especially within the Haudenosaunee, we have the concept of the two-row which means the settler state does its own thing. They stay in there on their side with their laws and their ship, their way of life, their society, their philosophies. It stays here. We have our own ways, our own philosophies, our way of life, and we proceed down the river of life together, but separate. And I think that that's the thing that I think that we have to try and really get and engage with settler society, is settlers got to get out of their own way of thinking that everything they do is the only way there is. Because we have thrived on an internal island for millennia and survived in a way that this land was lush and gorgeous and was capable of supporting a vast group of people. The estimations of our Haudenosaunee population at the time of contact is between 4 and 11 million people. And by the time we hit the American Revolution, there was about maybe 6,000 to 8,000 of us. Basically, disease and warfare had almost wiped us out. So one of the other things that we try to talk to, especially our youth, is the understanding, and this is something that really freaked me out when I found out, there's only 120,000 Haudenosaunee people on the entire planet. So our population is so small that we have to build ourselves back up, but build ourselves up with those philosophies and those ideas of how we live a good life intact. Otherwise, we are going to get washed over by the American state. We've held on this long. I want us to hold on a lot longer. And so these are the kind of things that I think about when we're doing our work. How do we tell the next generation? And as we say, the Haudenosaunee philosophy of the 7 generations originates with us. We say, we are looking after this place and this planet and all of the things in creation for the next 7 generations. So we have to do this in a way that's going to look feasible for us now, but also for those coming phases. And so I think that when we start talking about that with our own people, they get it. I think that there's I used to be a big I used to scoff a lot at the idea of blood memory until I went to the hide tanning camp and put my hands on the hide and started fleshing it. And then I was like, I have done this before. My hands know how to do this. I understand what this is and what we're doing here in an innate way that was it was almost spiritual. So I think that we all have that capacity for the remembrances of how we were. And it's just a matter of kind of peeling back those colonized layers, those internalized layers that say we're not as good as, because we are. In some cases, I like to think, we're often better than the prevailing thought. So we need to bring those out, infuse our youth with that pride, because it is, we have a lot to be proud of. Not only as Haudenosaunee, but as an Indigenous people. We lived in this land, in these continents, for millennia. And in a way that was actually, in a lot of ways, influenced settlers in how they built their own society. Our governance model is the model for the American government system. They ripped us off. They ripped off our symbols of governance, the eagle holding the five feathers. It's 5 too, it's 5 arrows in its talons. That's us. They ripped us off. And their governance model with the House of Representatives, the Senate, and a president is essentially our Council of Matrons, our Council of Chiefs, and the Tadadaho. Except that they left out the piece about the women. The women are actually the power with the veto power and who have the stewardship of the land at their heart. And we had a wampum gathering last year where we had all of our chiefs come in and explain our wampum. And it was one of the most fabulous things we'd ever done. It was a Protect the Track project. And they came in, and the Tadadaho said something that I will never forget. He said that America came to its power because they used our system, but it will fall because it's not balanced right. It will fall. And we're going to be left, as Indigenous people on these lands, when the settler state falls, we're still going to be here. And so we have to decide, how are we going to look? What's it going to look like for us when that happens? So these are the things that I think about on a daily basis. I don't mean to be like an alarmist, but I do think about these things. Because you can see where climate change is going. You can see where the economy is going. The level of gun violence in that country down there, sooner or later they're going to erupt into another civil war. Sooner or later, the writing's on the wall. It's just a matter of when. So we, as the people who kind of understood how governance actually should work, we'll have to have all of that kind of still in place to say, this is how it works, not the way that you perverted it. So I think that these are things that we talk a lot about, and because all of justice is all around those things. It's inherent in our governments. It's inherent in our languages. It's even inherent in the way we gather food. So I think those are the things that we have to look for in order to not only reinvigorate our nations and get back to that natural justice that we do want, but also to take our place in our rightful place. That the way that the Two-Row and all of the other treaties signed in this land, because they were all about that, getting back into balance that way. So that's how I think that, that's where we focus our attention and not get co-opted by the power of money that comes into our communities. Because sometimes there's a lot, and it comes from dubious sources. So we have to be careful. So now after that.
I don't have to say anything, Terri said it all. All I'm gonna say though is we just have to take our power back. And Canada, US, you do your own stuff. When I was president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, and when I finished my term, it was horrible because my cousin Tashina was found murdered, and it was one of the most traumatizing things that had ever happened in my lifetime. And at that time helping families, and then it happening to my own family. And for all those years, 5 years, and part of the job was to meet with parliamentarians.
right? It was a very political position. And meeting with parliamentarians, oh, I'll give you 10 minutes to meet with them, right? And that's like, okay, I'm gonna have 10 minutes, and they don't have a friggin' clue about who we are as a people. That just bugged the shit out of me. Because they're making decisions about our people, and they have no clue. They have no clue about our people. And so at the end, I had to meet with the minister. I remember meeting with the Minister of Justice. It was Vic Taves at the time. And you're sitting across the table, and we had just buried Tashina probably 2 weeks before. And I came back to work, and that was probably my first task. I was so angry. And I don't even remember what I said to him. I don't even remember the words that I said. I just know I was so angry, and I was saying things to him. All I remember is seeing his face was getting brighter red and red and red, and his eyes were getting bigger and bigger. Because whatever I said to him, I told him, I almost felt like I said, you stay the frick away from our people. Because you're not helping. You're not doing anything to protect Indigenous women. And so, and then that's when I thought, I can't do this anymore. Felt like I was banging my head against a brick wall on a daily basis, all day long, with this Canadian government who has no idea about who we are as a people. And that's when I said, okay, I'm gonna focus. My focus is on empowering our people and empowering our ways and making sure that we have the knowledge that we need to carry on and following what Terry's saying. They're gonna fall. They're gonna fall apart. And they're gonna come back to our people and say, how did you survive all those hundreds of years? How did you do it?
Give us 10 minutes.
I'll give them 10 minutes.
It's a tough question. I have days where I'm like, why am I still doing this work? I have tough days. I've lost family members to opiates or to fentanyl or violence, and you wonder why am I still doing this? Right? And then I look back more like over a number of years, and I actually see some systemic change. And I see like this revitalization in our communities. And I see my daughter's generation using language that we would have never used. Like my generation talked about tolerance, which is fucking ridiculous, by the way, as opposed to acceptance, because that's not an Indigenous way to tolerate something, but like a whole societal thing. And so when they talk about things, it's language of acceptance. So I still have a lot of hope, particularly in our future. They look at the world a different way. They're actually really critical of like the things we've done or what's happened, but also very ingenious in thinking about it. And I always say that, like anyone who's ever heard me speak, my most famous phrase is knowledge is power. And once you know something, you don't unknow it. You don't unknow it. You choose to ignore it, you're willfully blind, but you don't unknow it. So take that knowledge or take as much information as you can and use it to your advantage, right? You use it to your advantage when you're in circumstances with politicians, with media, with folks to entice them. But I always challenge people. That's my big thing. Not in necessarily groups of Indigenous people, but when I'm talking to judges and lawyers and crowns, I challenge them. Like, here's all this information. It's so easily at your fingertips. Go learn it, do it, take that knowledge. It's going to help you. And if you can't, and if you refuse and you don't want to, then you're choosing to be willfully blind. And so I always try to challenge people and say to them, like, you have an opportunity here. Because quite frankly, a lot of Indigenous philosophies, ways, and paths are much better than yours. It's just that simple. They're much better than yours. And if everybody was using that same theology, the same spirituality, the same concept of like that humanity, then we would be kinder to each other, right? Like I am a damn good lawyer and I'm a zealous lawyer and I can be sharp. And you know why? That's the Canadian, that's the Canadian education system that's trained me to be that way. Because when I'm in my own world, when I'm with my own family, when I'm in ceremony, that's all like tears of healing and love. And that's why I can be with people. They're like, oh, how can you do this work with, survivors and victims? It's hard work. It hurts every day. But there's also a level of love and kindness and a connection you make with people. That unbreakable bond. And that's what this is about at the end of the day, right? It's humanity. And if you don't have that fighting spirit to carry on, there's always a way to help some other way, right? You don't have to spit bullets, and you can like prepare the soup. You can bring the water. There's always a way. When I'm like at my lowest and I can't get the words out, I'm helping an elder to carry the smudge. I'm out in the bush picking medicine. There's always a way. There's always a way. And it doesn't matter if you're feeling this tiny or you're feeling massive, you can always find a way. And if you don't have that hope, if you don't have that belief in that we can always succeed, because gosh darn it all, we're still here. We've had that tenacity, it's in our blood memory, and we're just gonna keep doing it. And when you find that, and you recognize that acknowledge exists right here, it makes you unstoppable.
Yeah, so if I think about holding the state accountable, for me, I think about, as pop-up you off, I think about, actually, what you're talking about with the two-row wampum has a lot of resonance in that there's about, I think it was in 1914, when the potlatch ban was on, a chief, Arcangelis, there's a record of bringing forward, what the community wanted to have this, basically to say that we're going to, we don't care if you're sending us to prison, we don't care what you're, doing to us in a sense. With your laws is that, what he brought forward was we'll dance as our laws ask us to dance. And you have your laws and we have ours. We're not asking you to abide by our laws. We're going to abide by our laws and you abide by your own. But to me, in that, the dance part is really significant because our laws are practiced, and that requires us having our bodies, which means all of us being able to be there, which means that, when I think about how we need to build up our own systems, that when we're missing so many members of our families and communities because of gender-based violence, we are not fully able to express our laws. We're not fully able to dance the dance that our laws compel us, to what it means to actually practice our laws in our land. So thinking about putting our bodies at the center means that in order to rebuild those systems, we all have to be oriented, in that way. So whether it's the two ships going side by side or whatever it is that, I think that requires real clarity about what direction we're headed. And so that's, to me, I think about it as like turning our backs on the state. We know the state is there, it's not going anywhere. We have to fend it off and, deal with the harms that it causes, like reduce the harm. Until it's, as you're saying, hopefully just cooling out. But, there needs to be that clarity that if we are oriented towards our laws and rebuilding up the ability to put our bodies, in relation to each other and our lands, which means the expression of our laws and nationhood, that requires that we all have a place there. And that means that we are all kind of facing in that direction. So, so I think instead of trying to hold them both, it's just an orientation, in another direction, and that means toward each other and towards the fullness of those systems. Because I think that clarity from back at that time is still there in a lot of our communities. But again, it's often only being seen in relation to certain political issues and not this issue. And we owe it especially to the families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people to build up that clarity, for each other and to continue. Because there's so many, it's not only for the violence that is happening now or to come, but, the grief and the mourning and the injustice continues for everyone that was lost. So I think if we have that orientation and clarity, for me, that's part of holding the state accountable is by saying, like, we're not going to focus on you so much anymore. Like, you're harmful, so we're, focusing over here.
Like, part of that accountability or information, is to take the things we're doing and, you can look at anyone's history on this panel and see the academic or activist work that they've done to raise awareness and, through research grants and through different projects. Right now in Canada, there's one of the little pitching for it. There's one called Tracking Justice, and it's counting the deaths, incarceration, and police use of force violence. And it's kind of the first of its kind that's actually finding the numbers and sharing. But then, like other programs or other great projects or other great organizations like No More Silence, it's finding space for families to share the narrative because it's their voices that matter in terms of the impact it has. So I'm encouraging you to look up Tracking Justice because I think people often think that Canada is this really great, wonderful place where we don't have these same issues as like the United States and that, but the reality is we do. And in the last year alone, we've had more deaths in the last year incarcerated and in custody than we've had in 10 years. So it's not getting better, it's getting worse.
I hope that you all got as much out of this as I did. I'm blown away. I'm like really revitalized and really needed this to hear all this. I'm so grateful to you all for coming. Thanks so much for joining me. I wanted to shout out to Yellowhead Institute for making it possible for our community members to be here. You know, because it's not a cheap conference and all that. So thank you so much. I'm gonna hand it over to Wanda now.
Okay, I only need one into this. Well, I have to say that it was a great to sit here and to listen to the Haudenosaunee women and then the Anishinaabe women and the and hoping that nobody notices that there's no other Mi'kmaq people in the room. But it's always great to hear how they start off really softly and by the end they like moving the wall. Right, and then begin to remember. Oh yeah, that was yesterday or whatever. It was like, yeah, it's all good, right? You just get better and better, you know, and I think that's what counts. You know, in the 40 some odd years and learning around the elders and spending time with them, they always told me that it was the law of nature. Yeah, try to get stuck in a rainstorm when you're out fishing, it's the law of nature. Because you have to get off the lake before the lightning starts. And life is so very simple in a lot of ways that, you know, it is about life. We must never forget where that life comes from. It comes from the water. You know, we sit within that water for 9 months before we're born. And that water is our first protector. And then we must remember to take care of that water. It's the water that flows before we come here. And there's no other way to get here except through the womb of woman. No matter how hard you might want to try to come through a petri dish. You know, and we have to remember that. Now, I don't know what you've all been listening to since this conference started, but I know that your head is all full of all kinds of stuff. And so my prayer for all of you as we head into that dream world, that the ancestors and the knowledge that we've learned, that we find a soft spot on that pillow. That as we go into that dream world and remember the people that we have met, stories we've heard, let's not forget those that have left a long time. And it is that work that we do. It's for them. Our people are being lost in prison system. They're being lost by child welfare. But nobody, we have not lost as many people as we have to bad drugs. It's not bad people, but it's bad drugs. That every day we lose somebody that taught us how to laugh, that reminded us to really like bad coffee because it was better than no coffee at all. You know, and their bread didn't have any butter on it, but they still ate the bologna sandwich. I mean, we can learn so much from each other. Whether you spend all your time in academia or down by the river. Just the time that you have honored us to hear these women speak. That was a good 25 years. Amazing work. It might only sound like it was an hour, but it wasn't. The time that I worked at P4W, in 1 year I had 6 suicides. I learned that year not to ask why. It didn't matter. And then it's only gotten worse around drug use. And I remember every day I have to say that one of the only other organizations in the city of Toronto is Aboriginal Legal Services, who is a harm reduction organization. And what does that mean? That means they work with everybody. They don't stop people from coming in the door. They don't stop supporting them. They don't stop feeding them. They don't stop going to the police department and fight for whatever you want to call it, because it's not justice, but So I gotta say, it was a really great opportunity to revisit some really great legacies, because that's what it is. When I started in Guelph Correctional Center as the native liaison or something they called us back then, by the time I left, Aboriginal Legal Services was starting to form in our office on the 3rd floor of the Native Canadian Center of Toronto, where most of the organizations were founded. Wandering Spirits Alive School is just now grade 12. We'll be graduating grade 12 students. So please don't ever give up, because you know what? There's no such thing as wasted time. That's okay, you can pick it. I hope you didn't break your heart. So, as I said, there's only one thing that we've given each other today that we can never take back. And that's the time that we've shared and the air that we have breathed together. If there's one thing that you can take away from today, and the great grandmothers that are sitting in front of you, just remember to laugh. Because it takes too much trouble to cry. So as the sun sets and the moon comes up, remember our children, remember our grandchildren, remember our great-grandchildren. But most importantly, I remember those that are not walking with us, but through us today. And so I hope that everybody finds a safe way home, wherever that is. And don't take anything away that makes you feel bad. you just leave it right here on the sidewalk. Cause you don't need to take it home with you. Because now you're gonna go home to your families. And somebody said something earlier, and I have to say that, yeah, go home and have some great sex. I don't know who it was over there that was saying that, but you know. Okay, Bev, I'm with you. I'll be driving home with her. But whatever it is, take care of yourself, don't hurt anybody. And we'll meet again somewhere, sometime. And then you can tell me all about the great sex, okay? Thank you, everybody. Keep an eye